Stay with me through this whole story, because the moment Raymond and Sylvia finally stepped across that farmhouse threshold and saw what Nora had created, their faces told a truth their mouths could never speak. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story stays with you, hit subscribe. There's something worth coming back for tomorrow. The law office of Hawkins and Briggs occupied the second floor of a slim brick building along the main street of Clarksville, Tennessee. The kind of place that smelled of aged documents and lemon polish. Framed certificates lined the walls. The receptionist spoke barely above a murmur, as if the entire building existed in a state of permanent reverence. On the morning of March 14th, Nora Callahan lowered herself into a chair that was too rigid and too dignified for a woman in a thrift store sweater and boots patched with electrical tape. She was 36. Her dark auburn hair was gathered back with a rubber band she'd fished from the bottom of her purse. Chloe sat to her left, 9 years old, quiet, drawing slow shapes on a notepad the receptionist had offered her. Ben pressed against Nora's right arm, 6 years old, still as only a child can be when he's travelled too far and rested too little. Nora's father, Walter Grimes, had died 5 weeks before that morning. 71 years old, a stroke before dawn, gone before the paramedics could reach him. He had been a quiet man and a complicated one, a former tobacco farmer who spent his final 2 decades drifting between small rural Tennessee properties, buying low, selling lower, never quite assembling the life he always seemed to be grasping toward. Nora was the one who drove 4 hours every few months to look in on him. She organized his medications after his first minor stroke 3 years prior, sat beside his hospital bed through 2 separate stays, helped him make sense of the paperwork doctors pressed into his hands. She hadn't done any of it expecting repayment. She did it because he was her father, and because no one else bothered. Her siblings, Raymond and Sylvia, had built their own lives at a comfortable distance. Raymond, 43, operated a reasonably successful landscaping business in Nashville. He had a gift for making his absence sound like personal sacrifice. Sylvia, 41, had married into ease in Chattanooga. Her communication came in clipped text messages and birthday cards that reliably arrived 3 days late. Neither had visited Walter in the last 2 years of his life. Nora didn't know this because someone told her. She knew because every time she pulled up to her father's small rental house, the guest room sat untouched, same towel folded on the bed, same half-empty water bottle on the nightstand, exactly as she'd left it months before. Attorney Theodore Hawkins was a compact man in his late 60s, silver reading glasses, the measured, unhurried energy of someone who had delivered hard news so many times he'd learned the only honest way to do it was straight through, without apology. He read the will in the order Walter had written it. Raymond received the savings account, $47,000. He also received the 2019 Ford pickup and a collection of antique farm tools Walter had kept in a rented storage unit. Sylvia received the investment portfolio, modest but real, valued at roughly $62,000. She also received Walter's personal belongings, his furniture, his books, his watches, the few pieces of jewelry their mother had left behind. Raymond let out a breath of quiet satisfaction. Sylvia permitted herself a small, careful smile and jotted something in the leather notebook she'd brought along, already calculating. Neither of them looked at Nora. Hawkins stopped mid-breath. He slipped off his glasses, drew the cloth from his breast pocket, wiped each lens once, set them back on his face. Then he looked at Nora with something she would carry in her memory until the day she died. Not quite pity, something deeper, something that already knew what these next words would do. Quote, 0, he read. Quote, 1. Raymond was the first to laugh, a clipped sound at first, restrained, almost polite, and then it broke loose entirely. Sylvia covered her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders gave her away. Nora didn't move. What property is that? She asked softly. Dad picked it up at a tax auction about 8 years back, Raymond said, dabbing at his eye. Paid $9. $9 actual dollars. Because no living soul wanted it. He used to talk about fixing it up someday, never got around to it. The county's been hounding him for years. Renovate or tear it down. It's condemned, Sylvia added, pulling herself together. There was a fire, years ago. One whole side took partial damage. Sections of the roof have collapsed inward. I believe there's a structural violation notice still attached to the property. She turned to Nora with something wearing the mask of sympathy. It's a liability, Nora. That's what it is. Hawkins produced a manila envelope and slid it across the table. Inside, documents and a key. Old iron, dark with age. Heavier than it had any right to be. There is one condition, Hawkins said. The property cannot be sold for a period of 18 months from the date of Walter Grimes' passing. After that window closes, you're free to sell or dispose of it however you choose. 18 months, Raymond muttered. 18 months of paying property taxes on a condemned building you can't get rid of. Sylvia leaned in with an offer she'd clearly rehearsed before walking through the door. __quote _12 _15,000. For a condemned farmhouse on 3.4 acres of Harlan County dirt that her father had bought for $9. The contempt in that number was breathtaking. Nora picked up the key, held it in her palm, cold, solid. It settled into her hand with a weight that felt almost deliberate, as though it had been waiting for her grip. __quote _13 __, she asked. Not to Raymond, not to Sylvia, to Hawkins, the only person in that room she trusted enough to ask. Hawkins studied her face. He told me that each of his children was receiving exactly what they deserved and exactly what they needed. He said you, in particular, would understand what to do with it, even if you didn't know that yet. You were always the responsible one, Raymond said, rising. She stared at the photograph for a long time. She had nowhere else to go. She and the children had been living out of her 2019 Honda Civic for 6 weeks, ever since the apartment in Memphis she'd rented on her caregiver's salary became impossible the week her last client died. She had $214 in her bank account, 2 children, a car with a slow leak in the rear left tire. And now a condemned farmhouse in a county she'd never once set foot in. Her brother thought it was a joke. Her sister thought it was an insult. But Nora Callahan looked at that photograph and saw something neither of them had bothered to look closely enough to find. Through all that damage and rot, through paint curling off in strips and a porch leaning like a tired old woman and windows sealed shut with plywood, the bones of that house still held. Fire had come for it. Neglect had come for it. 30 Tennessee winters had tried to pull it apart board by board. The walls remained. And sometimes Nora thought, her fingers tightening around that key, the walls are the whole point. She woke Chloe and Ben softly, gathered them both against her in the parking lot outside Hawkins and Briggs, held them there in the sharp morning cold, just breathing, just feeling the weight of their small bodies against hers. Then she strapped them into the back seat, typed 22 Dust Mill Road into her phone, and turned the engine over. They had a farmhouse waiting. The drive into Harlan County ran just under 2 hours. Nora drove wrapped in the kind of focused stillness that had become her native language over the past 6 weeks. No radio, eyes locked on asphalt, her mind grinding through numbers and possibilities the way it always ground when every option was bad and she needed to carve a good one from nothing. Chloe sat behind her with a library book she'd borrowed 3 towns back and never returned. Ben had drifted off again, his cheek flattened against the glass, mouth hanging slightly open. The city's frayed edges dissolved into smaller towns, then smaller still. Then the long open stretches of rural Tennessee unrolled before them, fields spreading wide, tree lines standing like dark borders, and the occasional farmhouse, set so far from the road it seemed to be hiding from the world. Nora had grown up in a small town not far from here. She knew this kind of country in her bones. She knew how silence lands differently out here, heavier, more honest than anything a city produces. She knew red clay after rain. She knew the particular way early spring light falls across an open field, soft and almost apologetic. Driving into this landscape didn't feel like going somewhere new. It felt like drifting back to a place she'd left without ever choosing to. The GPS pulled her off the main highway onto a county road, then off that onto gravel running between two overgrown fields. A rusted mailbox tilted at the property's edge, the numbers 22 barely readable beneath a crust of brown corrosion. Nora turned in slowly. Gravel popped beneath the tires. She drove maybe 100 yards before the farmhouse filled the windshield and her foot found the brake on its own. The photograph Hawkins had given her, it had lied. Distance had softened everything in that picture, made the damage polite. In person, nothing was polite. 2 stories of weathered white, sitting on a low stone foundation, and the whole structure looked like it had been losing a slow war with time for 3 decades straight. The front porch had pulled away from the house on the left side. It sagged toward the earth, at an angle that said the next hard wind would settle things permanently. Every ground floor window was either sealed with plywood or shattered clean through. Glass gone, frames dark and swollen with moisture. The fire Sylvia had mentioned, it had eaten most of the right side of the second floor. The exterior wall up there was charred black and bowing outward, and a whole section of roof above it had caved in, leaving a raw gash in the roofline where blackened rafters reached toward open sky. Weeds owned the yard entirely. A collapsed fence ran along the left side of the property, its posts rotted through at the base, lying flat in the grass like something that had simply stopped trying. Behind the house, Nora could make out the shape of a barn, or what had once been a barn. Now just a skeleton of grey timber holding nothing. An old county notice, stapled to a wooden stake near the drive, read, "Condemnation Order," in heavy black letters. Faded, but legible. The county seal still visible beneath the grime. Ben had woken during the slow crawl up the drive. He pressed his face to the window and stared. "Is that our house?" Nora looked at it for a long moment. "It's going to be," she said. Chloe glanced up from her book. "It looks broken." "It is," Nora said, "but broken things can be fixed." She said it with more conviction than lived inside her. "Because that was what you did when your children were watching you decide whether to fall apart or stand." She stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. The yard was soaked from recent rain, and the weeds drenched her boots to the ankle before she'd taken 3 steps. She circled the property first, the way her father's illness had taught her. Walk the full perimeter before you cross the threshold. Study the foundation, read the roofline, run your eyes along every exterior wall. The stone foundation was old, but it was honest. Mortar crumbling in spots, yes, but the stones themselves sat massive and unmoved, the way they'd sat for over a century. The left side and the front of the house, untouched by fire, stood structurally sound. Wood gone soft in patches, but beneath it, the framing held. The porch looked terrible, peeling, sagging, dramatic in its decay, but that was cosmetic, surface wounds, not bone deep. The right side and part of the rear told a different story entirely. Fire had done its work there, and the years that followed had finished what the flames started. Rain, wind, rot. Season after season of neglect pressing down. But the bones were there. Nora stood at the back of the property and made herself look at this house not for what it was, but for what it could become. Wide windows, good proportions, a generous footprint, 3.4 acres of land stretching out around her, and somewhere along the back edge, a creek she could hear but not yet see. A barn, damaged, leaning, but still standing. She walked back to the car, retrieved the key from the envelope. The front door was padlocked with a chain rusted nearly through. She didn't even need the bolt cutters she'd bought on the way. Steady pressure, a dry snap. The chain gave like it had been waiting to let go. She fit the old iron key into the lock. It resisted, ground against rust, then turned, a deep mechanical click that echoed off the porch boards like a heartbeat restarting. Nora pushed the door open. The smell reached her first, damp wood, ash, old earth. And underneath all of it, something she couldn't name yet. Something dry and faintly sweet, like old paper, like cedar. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes pull meaning from the dimness inside. Chloe appeared under one arm, Ben under the other. The three of them stood together at the threshold of a condemned farmhouse in Harlan County, Tennessee. $200 in the bank, nowhere else to go. Nora took a breath. Then she stepped inside. The interior was darker than the outside had prepared her for. She moved through the entrance slowly, phone lights slicing the dimness, both children close behind. The entry hall ran narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, with a low ceiling and walls buried under peeling wallpaper. Faded floral print, yellow and green. It had bubbled and separated from the plaster in long, curling strips, like skin shedding from something forgotten. The floor was wide plank wood, hidden under debris. Plaster dust, leaves blown through broken windows. The scattered remains of what had once been furniture, a wooden chair with 3 legs, a picture frame with no glass, its backing swollen with moisture. Nora tested each step before committing her weight. The boards flexed, but held. She moved into what had been the main living room, and stopped. Even through the damage, this room was larger than she'd expected. Ceilings higher than typical farmhouse construction, maybe 10 feet, unusual for a rural Tennessee property of this age. The fireplace on the far wall rose brick from floor to ceiling, wide enough to stand inside, its mantel still intact beneath a thick coat of grey dust. 2 windows flanked it, both boarded from the outside, but large, their frames showing the kind of width and height that would flood this room with light if those boards ever came down. She moved through to the kitchen, smaller, practical, a cast-iron wood-burning stove still standing against the back wall, heavy, dark, entirely solid. The counters had rotted through in places, the sink had pulled away from the wall, but the layout was sensible, and the exterior wall showed no structural compromise. A back door led out to what had been a small covered porch, and beyond it, the yard and the barn. The door hung crooked in its frame, but opened when Nora lifted it slightly and pushed. The right side of the house she approached with care. Fire damage concentrated here, what had been a sitting room or study. The ceiling above had partially collapsed, dragging sections of the second floor down with it. Nora did not go far into this room. She stood at its entrance, assessed, stepped back. This was not where she would start. This was a problem for later, for when she had more knowledge, more resources, and something closer to a plan. The staircase climbed the left interior wall, far from where the fire had reached, and it caught her off guard. Those treads were wide, hewn from heavy timber that had barely shifted across all the decades this house had stood. Nora ascended slowly, one hand against the wall, testing every step. 3 rooms divided the second floor. The 2 on the right side carried smoke damage, one with a whole section of roof caved in, letting a column of grey afternoon light pour through. But the bedroom on the left side, the fire had never touched it. Small, square, a single window facing out over the fields, dusty floor but level, walls intact. This would be their room. For now, this was enough. That evening she made up 2 sleeping areas on the floor with blankets hauled from the car. She found a section of kitchen floor that held firm, swept it clean with a branch dragged from the yard. They ate crackers and peanut butter by the glow of her phone. Ben dropped into sleep the way he always did, completely, without argument. Chloe lay on her back, staring at the ceiling for a long time before her voice came through the dark. Quiet, almost a whisper. Nora lay beside her. She stared at the same ceiling. Quote, 25, she said. Quote, 26. The first week was survival, nothing more. Nora drove to the nearest town, a small place called Millbrook, 12 miles down the county road, and bought the cheapest cleaning supplies she could find. Broom, mop, garbage bags, a box of basic tools, a utility knife. She spent 2 full days doing nothing but hauling debris from the ground floor, bag after bag carried out and piled at the property's edge. She found rhythm in the labor the way she always had with physical work, that particular rhythm that silences the thinking mind and lets the body lead. She set a camp stove on the kitchen counter for heating water and simple meals. She located the water shutoff and the electrical panel, both disconnected. Something else entirely, a seam, straight, deliberate, running vertically from about knee height to above her head, not a crack from settling, a seam that had been plastered over, painted, intentionally hidden, but unmistakably there. She pressed harder. The wall gave slightly, not collapsing, flexing in a way that solid plaster over solid framing should never flex. Nora stepped back, looked at that wall with completely different eyes. She swept her flashlight along it slowly, and now that she knew what to look for, she could see it. A rectangle, roughly 3 feet wide, 5 feet tall, plastered and painted to match the surrounding wall so precisely that no one would ever notice it, not unless they were pressing their hands against every surface, searching for something wrong. Someone had placed something behind that wall, and someone had gone to extraordinary effort to ensure nobody would ever find it. Nora stood very still in the quiet farmhouse. Flashlight trained on that rectangle. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not desperation. Something closer to the feeling that rises at the very beginning of something, when you don't yet know what it is. But every instinct in your body is telling you to pay attention. She went to find a hammer. The hammer was an old one from the barn, its handle worn glass smooth by decades of someone else's grip, its head solid, heavy. Nora stood before that plastered rectangle in the living room wall. She held the hammer for a long, still moment, then swung. The first blow punched clean through. A small cloud of white dust drifted upward. She pulled back and struck again, widening the gap. Then she stopped, lifted her flashlight into the opening. What waited behind the plaster was not insulation, not framing, not the hollow, dark cavity she'd braced herself for. It was wood. Old wood, black with decades, fitted together with a precision that spoke of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Horizontal planks, smooth and tight-joined, not structural, something built with purpose, something concealed on purpose. Nora slowed down. She stopped swinging and started peeling, removing plaster in careful sections, pulling chunks free with her bare hands, setting them on the floor quietly, as though the sound might disturb whatever had been sealed away in there. 20 minutes of patient work before she understood what she was seeing. A cabinet, built directly into the wall cavity, framed and fitted with horizontal shelves that stretched the full height and width of that plastered rectangle. The wood was dark walnut, old growth, dense and fine-grained in a way modern lumber has forgotten how to be. The craftsmanship stopped her cold. Every shelf sat perfectly level, wooden pegs instead of nails. Joinery tight and clean after what had to be decades entombed behind plaster. And on those shelves, objects, wrapped in cloth gone stiff and brown with age. Nora reached in, lifted the nearest bundle, unwrapped it slowly. A glass bottle, dark amber, hand-blown, its shape irregular in that unmistakable way no machine ever produced. She set it down with care and reached for the next. A ceramic pitcher, cream-coloured, a blue painted pattern ringing its middle. The kind of folk pottery American craftsmen shaped by hand in the early 1800s. Another cloth fell open to reveal a small wooden box with a brass latch. Inside, nested in velvet that had gone soft and dark with decay, coins. She held one up to the flashlight beam, the date pressed into the metal, 1847. She sat back on her heels, looked at what spread before her. She was no antiques expert. She had no special knowledge of collectibles or historical artifacts. But she knew enough to know this wasn't junk. Every piece had been wrapped with deliberate care, hidden with intention. Someone had constructed a concealed cabinet inside the wall of this farmhouse and filled it with things they believed were worth protecting. The question hung in that dusty air. When and why, and what exactly was she holding? If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel. It means a great deal to us. Chloe appeared in the doorway while Nora was still on her knees, surrounded by unwrapped objects. Her daughter's eyes went wide. She crouched beside her mother, picked up the ceramic pitcher with both hands, carefully. The way she handled things she already understood were fragile. Nora said. Ben trailed in behind his sister, saw the hole in the plaster, immediately wanted to make it bigger. Nora redirected him to flashlight duty instead, which he accepted with tremendous seriousness. They spent the rest of that afternoon documenting everything. Nora photographed each object before and after unwrapping, using her phone with the flashlight propped against the wall for clarity. 23 objects in total, the cabinet surrendered. Glass bottles of varying sizes, all hand-blown. 4 pieces of ceramic pottery, each one hand-painted. The coin collection alone held more than 60 individual pieces, dates spanning the 1820s through the 1880s. A small oil lamp, its glass chimney still intact. 2 hand-carved wooden figures, folk art, one a horse, one a human form, both rendered with exceptional detail. And at the very back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth, and then again in a piece of old leather cinched with cord, a journal. Small, bound in brown leather gone dark and rigid with age. Nora untied the cord with careful fingers, opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the penmanship of someone trained formally in an earlier era. The ink had weathered to a soft brown, but every word remained sharp and clear. At the top of the first page, a name written in deliberate, careful letters. Elias Greer. Beneath it, a date. April 1888. Nora lowered herself to the dusty farmhouse floor, her 2 children pressed close on either side, and began to read by the glow of her phone screen. The voice rising from those pages was measured, exact. The voice of a man who never wasted a word and stood behind each one he chose. Elias Greer had been a craftsman, a furniture maker, a woodworker who had raised this farmhouse with his own hands in 1871 and never left it for the rest of his days. He had never married, he had no children, and in the spring of 1888, feeling his body beginning to fail, he had made a choice about the objects he'd spent a lifetime creating and collecting. He chose to conceal them, not from fear, not exactly, from what he described, in his own careful words, as a desire to keep them from those who would sell them without understanding what they were. He believed the right person would come eventually. He wrote that he trusted the house itself to hold everything safe until that person arrived. He catalogued every object placed inside the cabinet, described each piece, recorded where several had come from, what they had cost him, in time, in material, in care. Nora turned pages slowly, using only the tips of her fingers. When she reached the final entry, she sat still for a long while. Then her gaze moved across the objects arranged on the floor around her, and something caught in her chest. These were not just old things. Elias Greer had been a craftsman of genuine, serious skill, working in an era when American folk art and handmade objects reached a level of quality the modern world had largely abandoned. The coins alone, based on their dates and the fragments of information she could pull up on her phone through the weak signal out here, might carry real value. The pottery, the glass, the carved figures, the lamp. She needed an expert, someone who truly understood what they were looking at. But sitting there on the floor of a farmhouse her father had purchased for $9, reading the journal of a man dead for over a century, a man who had trusted his house to guard his life's work, Nora Callahan felt something shift deep inside her chest. Her father had known. He must have known. Walter Grimes had bought this property at a tax auction and done nothing with it. Never renovated, never sold, never even mentioned it to her directly. But he had left it to her, specifically, deliberately. Not to Raymond, who would have flipped it the same week. Not to Sylvia, who would have hired someone to clear the place without glancing twice at a single thing inside. To her, the one who showed up, the one who paid attention, the one who could recognize what something was worth when no one else bothered to look. She closed the journal gently and held it in both hands. Beyond the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields burned gold in the late afternoon light. Ben had fallen asleep against her arm. Chloe sat examining the hand-carved horse with quiet focus, turning it slowly, tracing its lines with one finger. Nora watched her daughter and thought about Elias Greer sealing that cabinet in 1888, writing in his journal that the right person would come. She thought about her father paying $9 for a condemned farmhouse and leaving it to the only one of his children who would have walked through the door instead of turning away. Sometimes the most important things in a person's life arrive disguised as nothing at all. The morning after discovering Elias Greer's hidden cabinet, Nora drove into Millbrook carrying the journal, 3 ceramic pieces wrapped carefully in clean cloth, and the coin collection sealed in a Ziploc bag she'd pulled from her car's glove compartment. She had searched online the night before, fighting the farmhouse's weak signal, and found an antiques shop in town, Harland Collectibles. A small storefront on the main street, operating for over 30 years, if its faded window lettering could be trusted. The owner, a compact, precise woman in her late 60s named Beverly Marsh, looked at what Nora placed on her counter and went very still. The particular kind of still that only comes from genuine expertise meeting something that demands its full attention. Beverly studied each ceramic piece beneath her magnifying glass in silence. She turned the coins one by one, placing certain ones into a separate, deliberate pile. She tapped the journal's cover gently. If it was authentic, and she believed it was a primary historical document. Elias Greer was a known figure in Harland County craft history. 2 of his pieces sat in the State Museum in Nashville. Nora heard every word. She absorbed them the way she absorbed most significant information. No visible reaction. Not until she'd had time to understand what she was actually being told. What are we talking about in terms of value? Beverly folded her hands on the counter. She wanted a full appraisal done by a qualified specialist before offering any numbers. But speaking as someone who'd spent 31 years in this business, Nora should not sell anything until she knew exactly what she had. Those objects should be treated as serious assets, handled accordingly. Nora drove back to the farmhouse with Beverly's card, and the name of an appraiser in Nashville who specialized in American folk art and historical artifacts. She'd called ahead from the parking lot outside the shop, made an appointment for the following week, and for the first time since leaving Memphis 6 weeks ago, she allowed herself to feel something cautiously close to hope. But hope without work was just wishing, and Nora had never been someone who wished. She was someone who worked. So she worked, every day from sunup until the light failed. She worked on the farmhouse because, whatever the artifacts might be worth, they were not worth anything yet. The property itself was condemned, uninhabitable, and it would stay that way until she changed it with her own hands. The same problem from the morning of the will reading remained. No money, no contractors, no resources except her own 2 hands, her own stubbornness, and the same refusal to quit that had carried her through 6 weeks of living in a car with 2 children. She began with the most urgent structural damage. The front porch had to be stabilized before someone got hurt. She found 4 solid timber posts in the collapsed barn, dragged them to the front of the house one at a time, used them to shore up the sagging porch supports. She watched a basic carpentry video 3 times on her phone before attempting a single cut. The work consumed 2 full days and left her shoulders aching in a way that felt permanent. But when she finished, the porch stood level and solid. The lean was gone. She went after the boarded windows next, pulled the plywood away from inside and out, cleared broken glass with gloves she'd improvised from duct tape wrapped tight around her hands. The effect was immediate, transformative. Light flooded the ground floor rooms and changed their entire character. He drove past the farmhouse one afternoon and spotted Nora up on the roof, patching damaged shingles with material she'd pulled from the barn. He swung into the drive, stood at the foot of the ladder, looked up at her for a long moment. 31. She didn't pause. "Learning," she said. He watched another minute. Then he walked to his truck, grabbed his own tool belt, came back, and climbed the ladder. "Move over. I'll show you the right way." Carl returned 4 more times over the next 2 weeks, never announced, always carrying something useful: a box of roofing nails, a tube of weatherproof sealant, once an entire sheet of plywood he claimed was left over from another job. He refused payment every time, deflected every offer Nora made. He had a daughter about her age, he mentioned once, and left it at that. A retired schoolteacher named B. Holloway, who lived 3 miles down the road, appeared one evening carrying a foil-covered casserole dish and 2 juice boxes for the children. She said she'd heard about the woman restoring the old Greer farmhouse, that's what locals had always called it, and wanted to see with her own eyes. She stayed 2 hours on the newly stabilized porch while Chloe showed her the hand-carved wooden horse and Ben demonstrated his hard-won expertise with the camp stove. Before leaving, she pressed Nora's hand. __quote _34 __. The Nashville appraiser, a careful, methodical man named Dr. James Whitfield, who specialized in 19th century American material culture, drove down to the farmhouse 3 weeks after Nora's call. He came to examine the full collection in its proper context. 4 hours he spent going through every object, photographing each piece, cross-referencing against his records, writing notes in a leather-bound notebook with quiet, focused intensity. Nora sat across the kitchen table watching him work. Chloe did homework nearby. Ben had fallen asleep on the freshly swept living room floor, a wooden horse tucked under his arm. When Dr. Whitfield finished, he closed the notebook, looked at Nora with the composed expression of a professional about to deliver significant news. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I want to be precise because precision matters here. The ceramic collection, exceptional. Pieces in this condition from this regional tradition were essentially museum quality. The coin collection included 3 genuinely rare specimens and one he needed to send photographs of to a colleague for confirmation, though his working estimate remained conservative. The carved figures, fine examples of Tennessee folk sculpture. The glass, period correct, with excellent hand-blown quality. The journal, a primary document of real historical significance." He opened his notebook to a page of figures and turned it toward her. "This is my preliminary range. Final appraisal will take several weeks and involve 2 additional specialists. But I want you to have a working number so you understand what you're dealing with." Nora looked at the page. The range Dr. Whitfield had written covered the collection as a whole. The low end, $340,000. The high end, $480,000. She read those numbers twice, looked up at Dr. Whitfield. He nodded once. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields stretched green and wide and entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had just shifted beneath her feet. She called Theodore Hawkins the following morning. Told him about Raymond's call, the nature of the argument being floated. Asked him directly, what exposure did she have? Hawkins was characteristically steady. The artifacts had been discovered within the property after title transferred to her. They were never inventoried as part of the estate because nobody knew they existed. Under Tennessee property law, contents discovered within an inherited property after transfer of title belonged to the title holder. Their claim held no merit. Quote, 38. Quote, he added. Quote, 39. Quote, people file legal actions for reasons beyond victory. They file to squeeze, to bleed resources, to exhaust someone they assume has less. Nora absorbed this. She asked what a defense would cost. Hawkins didn't soften it. If they push through discovery, you're facing serious fees, possibly $50,000 or more, depending on how aggressive they get. Against a collection valued at nearly $500,000, a real number, not devastating given what's at stake, but real. Nora thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse Elias Greer had raised in 1871, and she thought about what was actually happening here. Her siblings had laughed at her inheritance. They had offered $15,000 for land and a structure now understood to hold potentially $500,000 in historical artifacts. They had walked out of that will reading without a backward glance, certain they'd claimed everything worth claiming, left her with the scraps. And now that the scraps had turned extraordinary, they wanted their portion. Not because they'd earned it, not because they'd worked for it or bled for it, or spent one frozen night on a bare floor choosing to believe, but because it existed, and they didn't have it. Sylvia called 2 days after Raymond. Different tactic, gentler, more personal. She spoke about childhood, about their father. Nora read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, photographed it, sent the image to Hawkins. His reply came within the hour. Expected, I'll handle the response. Don't worry. She wasn't worried, not exactly. He'd driven down from Clarksville the evening before, stayed at the small highway motel rather than make the trip twice. He carried a leather briefcase that Nora had come to understand held everything her father had ever said, written, or communicated about the will. Organized, documented, with the thoroughness of a man who had anticipated exactly this moment. Raymond and Sylvia arrived together with 2 attorneys from a Nashville firm, both younger than Nora expected, both carrying the careful confidence of people who'd been told their case was strong. Raymond wore a dark suit and stared straight ahead. Sylvia wore grey. She looked at Nora once in the hallway, an expression that seemed to reach for regret but landed closer to anxiety. Their attorneys had filed a motion claiming the artifacts found at 22 Dust Mill Road were undisclosed estate assets, inequitably distributed through omission. The argument hinged on a single assertion, that Walter Grimes had known about the hidden cabinet and its contents when he drafted the will, that he had deliberately kept that information from the other beneficiaries. It was a manufactured case. Nora had recognized that from the start, but manufactured cases filed with courts still demanded answers, still devoured time, still bled money and energy dry. And that was exactly why they had been filed. The judge assigned to the matter was Honorable Ruth Daring, 60 years old, well known across Harlan County for cutting through cases with efficiency and tolerating nothing she deemed a waste of the court's time. Hawkins presented first, methodical, unhurried, the way Nora had come to expect him to be in everything he did. He submitted documentation from every meeting he had conducted with Walter Grimes during the drafting of the will, his own meticulous notes from each session, and a signed affidavit he had prepared, one Walter had signed 6 months before his death, specifically addressing the Dust Mill Road property. He placed this document before Judge Daring and explained that Walter Grimes had foreseen a legal challenge, had taken deliberate steps to shut it down before it could begin. The affidavit stated clearly, in Walter's own words, that the property at 22 Dust Mill Road was being left to Nora Callahan in its entirety. All structures, all land. All contents therein, known and unknown. This distribution reflected his considered and voluntary judgment, made in full possession of his faculties. Judge Daring read the affidavit with care. She set it down. Then she looked at the attorneys for Raymond and Sylvia over her reading glasses, with an expression that needed no translation. Opposing counsel argued that known and unknown was vague language, that it could not reasonably cover artifacts of significant undisclosed value. Hawkins responded that known and unknown was, in fact, precise language, chosen deliberately, designed to cover exactly this eventuality. The testator's intent, he said, could not have been made clearer, unless Walter had torn open the wall himself and snapped a photograph. Judge Daring made a sound that, in a less formal setting, would have passed for a short laugh. Then opposing counsel advanced the secondary argument, the one Nora had been dreading most. They suggested that Nora's prolonged presence as caregiver during Walter Grimes' final years represented an opportunity for undue influence, that the disproportionate nature of the bequest warranted scrutiny of the circumstances surrounding the will's execution. That was the argument that turned a legal filing into something personal. The suggestion that Nora had manipulated her own father, that her care had been calculated, not genuine, that the woman who had driven 4 hours every few months, organized medications, sat through hospitalizations, had done all of it to position herself for an inheritance. Nora sat at the table beside Hawkins. She kept her face still. She had prepared for this, had known it was coming from the moment Raymond made his first phone call on the barn roof. It still landed hard. Not because it shook her certainty about what she had done or why she had done it, but because it took something real and human and difficult and crushed it into a legal tactic. That reduction was its own kind of cruelty. Hawkins responded without raising his voice. He submitted affidavits from Walter Grimes' physician, from his neighbor of 12 years, from the staff of the rehabilitation facility where Walter had spent 6 weeks after his second stroke. Each document attested to Walter's mental clarity, his iron will, his explicit, repeatedly stated pride in Nora's dedication, the complete absence of any sign that his decisions were shaped by anything other than his own clear judgment. Then, Hawkins submitted records showing that Raymond and Sylvia had not visited their father in the final 2 years of his life. Not once. He did not editorialize. He simply placed the documents before the court and let them speak. Judge Daring reviewed everything before her with the sharp, unhurried focus of someone who'd spent decades reading rooms. The courtroom had gone quiet, that particular silence when everyone already knows what's coming, but nobody dares say it. Raymond sat with his jaw locked. Sylvia had stopped writing 20 minutes ago. She was staring at the table. Judge Daring set the last document down and spoke. The claim of undisclosed estate assets found no support in the will's language or the documented intent of the testator. The claim of undue influence found no support in any evidence presented and was, in fact, directly contradicted by the defense's substantial documentation. The motion was denied, all of it. She said this in the measured, final tone of a door being closed for good. She looked at opposing counsel and told them she hoped their clients understood that the court's time was a shared resource. Then she moved to the next case on her docket. Nora sat still for a moment after the gavel fell. Hawkins gathered his papers with the quiet efficiency of a man who had never doubted this outcome. Outside, the October air hit cold and bright. The maples along the main square had turned fully red. Raymond and Sylvia came through the courthouse doors a minute behind Nora and Hawkins. Their attorneys were already on their phones. She climbed out and stood in the yard of 22 Dust Mill Road and looked at the farmhouse in the October light. The windows were clear, the porch was straight and solid. Smoke from the kitchen stove's chimney rose in a clean, thin line against cold blue sky. Inside, she could hear Ben laughing at something, and Chloe's voice answering him. The building was still condemned on paper. There was still so much work ahead, but it was hers, completely, officially, finally hers, and nobody was going to take it. She went inside to her children. The artifact sale unfolded in stages over the following 3 months. Dr. The coin collection split between 2 buyers, a numismatic specialist in Chicago and a private collector in Virginia who wanted the 3 rarest pieces specifically. The carved wooden figures found their home at a folk art gallery in Asheville, one that had been chasing examples of Tennessee sculpture from that era for a permanent exhibition. The glass bottles and oil lamp moved through a specialist auction house in Nashville, dealers in 19th century American domestic objects. The journal went last. That sale was the most deliberate of all. Nora spoke with 4 institutions before accepting an offer from the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville. They wanted it as a permanent addition to their collection of regional craft history documents. They wanted the 2 carved figures too. The Providence documentation. She didn't pay off debt, though she carried some. She didn't buy a new car, though hers was dying. The first thing she did was pick up the phone and call the Harland County Building Department. She requested a meeting with the county inspector to begin the formal process of reviewing and lifting the condemnation order on 22 Dust Mill Road. She had been working on the farmhouse for months. She knew what it needed structurally, and now she had the resources to do it properly. She wanted it done right. She wanted it done officially. She wanted the building that Elias Greer had raised in 1871 with his own hands to be recognized by the very county that had condemned it as the sound and valuable structure it actually was. She hired Carl Briggs to oversee the renovation. He accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd been hoping she would ask. She hired locally for everything she could, paid fair wages, took the time to explain to each worker what she was preserving and why. The cast-iron wood-burning stove in the kitchen was restored by a specialist, Carl New, in Knoxville. The wide plank floors were cleaned and refinished by hand, every single board kept original. The fireplace was repointed, the chimney rebuilt from the roofline up. The fire-damaged right side of the house, that was the largest undertaking. New framing, new exterior walls. But Carl was meticulous about matching materials and methods to the original construction wherever he could. The barn rose again over 6 weeks in early spring. Built from timber milled from trees that had fallen on the property during a winter storm, trees Nora had set aside specifically for this purpose. The new barn was structurally modern, but shaped to look as it had in Elias Greer's time. Board and batten siding, a gambrel roof, wide doors opening south. The collapsed fence along the property line gave way to split rail, sourced from a farm 2 counties over that was clearing cedar posts from a field. The yard was cleared and planted with a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house. Herbs and vegetables in raised beds built from reclaimed lumber. The same approach Nora had read about in Elias Greer's journal. He described the garden his mother kept in exactly that spot. B. Holloway came to see the finished farmhouse on a Saturday in late April. The same day the county inspector signed off on the lifted condemnation order. She stood on the front porch, solid, level, painted white, and looked at the house. The yard, the barn, the fields stretching beyond. The open house she held that evening wasn't meant as a celebration. Not exactly. More like a quiet acknowledgement. Something had been finished. The people who poured themselves into it deserved to witness what their hands had helped shape. Carl came with his wife. Beverly Marsh from Harland Collectibles arrived and lingered in the living room, studying the wall beside the fireplace. Carefully restored now, freshly painted, the hidden cabinet removed, but its outline still barely visible, if you knew where to look. Dr. Whitfield made the drive down from Nashville and moved through every room with the calm satisfaction of a man whose knowledge had served something that mattered. Theodore Hawkins came and stood in the kitchen, said nothing for a long while, then said, a lean, careful-looking man with a woodworker's hands. It hung now in a small frame on the living room wall, near where the hidden cabinet had been. Chloe said he should be able to see what happened to his house. Nora agreed completely. That evening, after everyone had gone, she stood on a rooftop deck she'd built from reclaimed lumber at the back of the house. Warm April darkness surrounded her. The fields stretched invisible in every direction. The creek murmured at the edge of the property. The farmhouse held solid beneath her feet. She thought about the morning of the will reading, Raymond laughing, Sylvia shaking her head, the key, cold and heavy in her palm. She thought about 6 weeks living in the car, the first night on the floor of a condemned building with 1 blanket and 2 sleeping children, and city noise bleeding through shattered windows. She thought about the hammer in her grip, and the wall that gave way, and the objects wrapped in brown cloth on a shelf that had waited in darkness for 130 years, for exactly the right person to uncover them. Her phone buzzed. A message from Raymond. It said only, "I heard it's beautiful." Nora read it once and placed her phone face down on the railing. She would answer eventually. Maybe the apology was genuine enough, or close enough to genuine, that it deserved a response at some point. But not tonight. Tonight belonged to the farmhouse and the fields and the creek and the 2 children sleeping inside and the craftsman whose journal had promised the right person would come, and the father who had known, with the quiet certainty of a man who understood his children completely, exactly who that person would be. Walter Grimes had paid $9 for a condemned farmhouse and left it to the daughter everyone else had pitied. What he had actually given her was everything. Not the artifacts, not the money, not even the land. He had given her the chance to discover what she was made of when everything else was stripped away. When all she had left was herself and a key that fit a lock nobody else had bothered to try. She had opened it. She had walked through. And what she built on the other side of that door, the home, the life, the proof of her own capacity, was worth more than any figure Dr. Whitfield had ever written in his notebook. Nora Callahan looked out across the dark Tennessee fields. She drew in the cold spring air, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely at peace. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story.